Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 323 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. In this second part of our three-part series featuring interviews with counselling and psychotherapy professionals, we continue exploring the topic of regulation. Today I'm joined by returning guest Susie Jamerson, a BACP accredited psychotherapist who will share her insights onto the ongoing call for regulation within our field. The discussion follows a successful civil case brought by Ella Jenner against her therapist Michael Lusada after allegations of rape during a 2016 bodywork session. Miss Jenner's case has generated significant media coverage and has sparked discussions in Parliament and the media in the UK about whether the profession should be subject to statutory government regulations. And if you missed the first interview on the subject with Dr. Anna Guy, you can find it on our website, counsellingtutor.com. Just go to the podcast tab and look for episode 322. And with that said, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
A very warm welcome to episode 323 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and a very happy new year to you if you are listening in real time. This is our first episode of 2025, and both myself, Ken Kelly, and Rory Oakes right here beside me are absolutely delighted to welcome you to our three topics, starting with our ethical sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about engaging with clinical supervision. Are you getting the most from your supervision? If you're a supervisor, are you giving the most to your supervisees? We're going to be delving deep into that. We then move on to practice matters, where it is part 2 of the interview that Rory has introduced, and that is with Susie Jamerson on the topic of regulation of counselling and psychotherapy. And then we move on to student services. If you're starting your year as a student, you are getting that resolve to go and do well in your studies this year. Well, we are going to power up your skills today. We're going to talk about learning through observing. So there you have it, 323. That's our number today. That's the episode number, starting with ethical sustainable practice, engaging with clinical supervision. So Rory, what is there to know about this? For me, all you do is you have to go to your supervisor once a month. I just want to put in brackets after that. That's not how it was for me, but yeah.
That ends that
there's more to it. You mean there's more to it than just going to a supervisor?
Do you know? I think there is, Ken. And I think a good start will be to quote from one of the professional bodies who says that supervision is essential to how practitioners sustain good practice throughout their working life. And that is a quote from the BACP Ethical Framework, 2018, page 22. And I think it sets a line in the sand, doesn't it? It sets a marker that it's essential. Supervision is essential, and it's about sustaining you in your practice. You know, the arc of practice for some therapists can be quite a wide one. They start as students, finding their way, and then they move through the arc of practice, becoming more competent, doing more CPD, becoming more reflective and reflexive, and eventually they find themselves in a place where it may be, and I'm sure you've experienced this, Ken, and certainly I have, where the person you were when you started with your supervisor, that fledgling therapist, has now kind of emerged, and he's now a more competent, more confident practitioner, and needs a different approach from the supervisor, needs a very different way of working. And I think my takeaway from supervision is the supervision I had when I started was very different to the supervision I had when my practice had matured.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's through growth. I mean, that's what we look for when we go to supervision. And so I just want to start at the beginning of when we're looking at supervision, we think maybe of supervision as our practice. I am going to have my supervision. I'm going to go to my supervisor. But what we're really doing when we're choosing a supervisor is we're choosing a supervisor for our clients as well as ourselves, because it's our clients that we take to our supervisor. And you mentioned growth, Rory, and that growth can come in many different ways. You know, you wouldn't expect that if you went to go and study counselling, that the tutor that you had at level 2 would be the same tutor that you would have while you were graduating your master's degree. Why? Because you will have different needs at different levels through your journey. And the same is true with when we go out into practice. You know, if we are truly growing, then we should be looking and reevaluating whether we're getting the most from our supervision, at least annually. And this is a great time to pop it in the old podcast, isn't it, as we start 2025, if you're listening in real time. But you would expect to gain different things from your supervisor as you grow within your practice and be challenged differently. And of course, like I said, it very much hinges on your client group as well. So if you've done any specific training that opens up a new client group to you that maybe your supervisor doesn't have training in that area, then there too is maybe a reason to look, am I getting the most? If my supervisor doesn't understand the training I've done of this specific presentation, maybe I need to look to have a second supervisor or to grow within my supervision and move on from the supervisor I have. But it is I guess it depends on the person. And I think what you want to avoid from this is just supervision becoming a comfortable, lovely place to go because you've known the person for so long and you get on really well. Because supervision should, by its very nature, be challenging and hold you and your practice in its hands, but challenge you to be the best you can be for your clients.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. It's a professional consultation, and there are lots of models of supervision that supervisors can draw on. But I think the point you make is a really good one. That it should fit not only for you at the stage you're in, but also for your clients and also for the training you've done. And a good example of that is, during the pandemic, lots of people migrated online, worked online, and there were very few supervisors who had any online and telephone counselling training. And we had a lot of supervisors at the time reaching out and asking, could Counselling Tutor provide that training, which we did. But it's really interesting that if you're working with a supervisor who doesn't understand what you're doing or has no training in the models that you're using, whether that's the delivery model, which is online and telephone, it's a different way of delivering therapy than in the room, or whether that's using a different modality, there's a danger that your supervisor won't understand the complexity and completeness of your practice. And as you said at the top of the podcast, Ken, we do this in service of our clients. So it's essential that when you get supervision, they're supervising the entirety of your practice. And I think that if that isn't the case, then, as you rightfully say, you either take secondary supervision, find a supervisor who has knowledge and expertise in that area, or you just move on. You move on and find a different supervisor. And through the years, it's not unusual for therapists to have 2, 3, 4 supervisors. Sometimes they work with 2 supervisors. Certainly, I've supervised one of the person I work with. She was an EMDR therapist. So clearly I couldn't supervise that aspect of her practice. She had a separate clinical supervisor for that. And that was fine. We contracted for it.
Yeah.
And she was very happy to have supervision for general practice, which I provided, and specialist supervision for EMDR practice.
Yeah, spot on. And I think that when we're speaking about clinical supervision and what's the reason for this slot being here, it's to kind of get you thinking about supervision and thinking about getting the most from your supervision. Are you being served? Are you serving your clients the best you can through your current supervision? And it's difficult to evaluate that unless you kind of have a peek behind the Wizard of Oz curtain and realize what a supervisor actually does. And we're in a privileged position in that Rory and I both trained as supervisors, clinical supervisors, and indeed in Counselling Tutor we train clinical supervisors. We've got a course in clinical supervision. If you're interested, Counselling Tutor, all the information is there. But peeking behind the curtain, there are kind of 3 main areas, and this is a model. This is from Proctor, 1987, suggesting that supervision has 3 key purposes. And when you're in supervision, you're bringing a client or you're bringing a challenge that you might have within your practice, see if you can map it to one of these 3 areas. And they're called normative, restorative, I can't say it, restorative,
I think it is.
Yeah, I'll leave you to say the big words. I'll stick with my dyslexia. And formative. So normative is maintaining professional standards and monitoring managerial issues. Restorative is support and stress reduction of you, the counsellor. Who are you? How is your well-being? And formative is skills and knowledge development. So it's an educative part of supervision where your supervisor may say, hey, you know what, from what you've brought today, I think you need to go and look at the Equalities Act a little bit deeper, or they might refer you to your ethical framework. So it's the education side of things. So in normative, the normative area of supervision is where the supervisor may explore with you areas of professional practice. And these can include ethical issues, how you might work with them. So this is all under normative. Legal issues relating to confidentiality. If you wonder, can I break that confidentiality? Should I break confidentiality? My client has just said this. That would fall under that section. And it may also overlap into different sections too. And then issues around complaints might be examined there, supporting your accreditation if you're growing within your practice. Restorative is more of a focus on you, who you are, and your ability to be well enough to be there for your clients, to avoid burnout, to keep your self-care routines going. And it may be issues around unplanned endings and how they affect you. You might be working with a client and you're just not getting anywhere. This person's stuck and you just feel you're going really round and round in circles and you feel de-skilled. Am I good enough for this client? Restorative, the supervisor would work on kind of building you up there and kind of decoding what's really going on. And any struggles that you might be experiencing in your day-to-day life. And then a formative aspect of supervision refers to the sharing of knowledge and methods that enhance your practice. And this is why I said there can be an overlap, because if you maybe had issues around a complaint or something like that, or an ethical issue, you may be looking at both normative and formative in the supervision practice there. So it's yeah, go ahead, Rory.
Yeah, it's not always. That's absolutely correct as the theory goes, Ken. And sometimes it doesn't appear that you're going in for normative or restorative or formative consultation. What can happen is that you go into your supervisor, and through the 1.5 hours that people have in supervision, usually 1.5 hours, it can be more, issues arise where it takes you to that place. So an example may be that therapist comes in and supervisor says, how are things? How's it going? And they say, well, I've got a client and I just don't feel skilled enough. I feel de-skilled. It's not going anywhere. And you would start as a supervisor in the restorative position. You'd be supportive. And I think it's really good at this point to highlight that restorative is not personal therapy. If it becomes clear within the session as a supervisor that someone's going through very deep personal issues, yes, you can be compassionate. Yes, you can be empathic, but it's not the place for therapy. Therapy is a different engagement, and it's done separately outside supervision with a therapist. But to get back to feeling de-skilled and feeling that you're not getting anywhere, it can start with restorative, being supportive, looking at how to reduce stress. And then there can be that educational part from the supervisor who says, well, let's look at the interventions. What have you been doing? And well, have you thought of this? Or just talking through the client and letting the client live within the session can then bring up new awareness. So you might move to formative. And then you may think, well, actually, what the client's bringing actually is a bit outside the therapist's skill set. They may need some other form of support. So then you might use the normative to maintain professional standards and say, do you think perhaps the reason you're struggling with this client is that you are at the end of your skill set, which is no shame attached to that. We can't be everything for everybody. Maybe a referral to help this client on for the benefit of the client and for the benefit of yourself. So all those positions within the proctor's what we call key purposes, normative, formative, and restorative, they can play out within 1.5 hours, Ken.
Oh yeah, very much so. And I also want to say that there's a lot more to it. That's not all that you learn on a supervision training course. No. It's like saying that person-centered therapy is all about unconditional positive regard, empathy, and not being judgmental. So there's more to it than that. There is a lot more complexity. But if you break it down, there's going to be those 3 areas that you might be touching on regularly throughout the session. And of course, speaking about getting the most out of supervision, we have to address barriers that may be in the way of you getting the most from your supervision. And the first barrier, and all of this is on a super duper handout, by the way, which I'll give you the link to in just a moment. You can go and get this, so you don't have to remember anything that we're just saying now. It's all on this document for you. Barriers to engaging in supervision. So we hear this one often, and many times from students who might be starting off and they're going out into placement, and it's not having a choice of the supervisor that you work with. You may be in an agency, and the agency says, well, we offer supervision. And you're going to have our supervisor, and that's your choice. You don't actually have a choice outside of that. That can be a barrier. It might be fine for some, but it might not fit for you. Supervisor not understanding the supervisee's modality. So at student level, you will be asked and called on to seek out a supervisor who works in the same modality that you're studying, so that you can kind of be supervised in that modality. And you can understand that maybe having a supervisor with a different modality could, in early stages, and I want to emphasize this, in the early stages of supervision, be a challenge. A much more mature practitioner, however, may actively choose a supervisor with a different modality to see how that is for them, to challenge them in different ways. But you would have to have an understanding of that modality, and the supervisor would, of course, need some form of understanding of the modality in which you are working. There could be a clash of personalities, because that happens everywhere. It doesn't matter, you can go to a new job, you can get a new group of friends, and you can say, I really just don't get on with that person. That can be a barrier to you engaging in supervision at the deepest of levels. And then I think this one for me, Rory, is by far the one that stands out, glows, waves a big flag. It's a biggie for me, in other words, and it's that fear of being judged. And all you need to do is kind of map this to the counseling process, where you're working with a client. If that client fears that they're going to be judged, or that what they're bringing to you is not going to be held in confidence, they're going to be very reluctant to engage in the process, and you're probably going to see weaker outcomes in that therapy. And exactly the same is true of supervision. If you're going in and you're holding something back because you fear that, I can't tell my supervisor that because they might say that I'm getting it wrong, that can be bad for you, for your practice, and for your clients, and in extreme cases can actually be dangerous, Rory.
It can be very dangerous, and I think it speaks to shame in supervision. I think we've spoken about shame in supervision on the podcast, and it's supervision shouldn't be a telling off. I've picked up supervisees who've moved their supervisors, and they've said, I've been told off by my supervisor for doing this. And they're told off. You don't tell supervisees off. It's not a schoolroom where you're the child and the teacher's the adult. You're two adults, and people do make mistakes or may have lapses in judgment, but you work through those processes professionally in an adult way. And I think if there's any kind of fear of shame, people will withhold information. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't really like going to my supervisor because I can't tell them everything, the next question to ask yourself, I think, is the supervisor a good fit for you? Are they a good fit for you? Because if you cannot bring all your practice, the totality of your practice to supervision, then you need to ask yourself some fundamental questions. One being, why is that? And I think that not being able to make full use of clinical supervision ends up with supervisees hiding clients and not speaking about them. And I guess that leads to not a lot of self-challenge or self-growth. And what happens, and this is a very present thing in our profession, I think, occasionally, is being risk averse. Part of being a supervisor is to look at measured risks in therapy in the aid and the service of the client. And I won't go too much into this because it's quite complex and nuanced. But by bringing all of your clients to supervision, even the ones that you feel you're failing in and you're not doing very well with or you're not getting along with, that is the area of supervision that's rich, has the potential for growth, and ultimately has the potential to have a great outcome for your client.
Yeah. There's almost a voice in me that wants to say, if you're really struggling with a client, if you're reluctant to bring a certain client to supervision, that's the one that you should spend the most time in supervision on. Work out what that's about, what's causing those feelings within you. So this is this chat just about, are you getting the most from your supervision, or how can you engage with clinical supervision in the best way? And with this being a new year, if you're listening in real time, perhaps, and this is a nice exercise actually, perhaps you can take into your supervision session and bring up with your supervisor how you might get the most out of supervision working together over the next year. Relook at what you're doing and how you're working, and be honest and truthful and say what works for you, and be honest and truthful and say what doesn't work for you, and explore that road together. If it's the right supervisor for you, you'll find the way. And this is not to say you're not getting great supervision at the moment. It's just this discussion on, can we get more out of supervision, engaging with clinical supervision to get the most out of it for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And that's what we exist for. We exist to be in service of our clients. And if we're not careful, if supervision becomes too comfortable or avoidant, then we really have to ask ourselves, are we working in service of our clients, or are we not? And life as a therapist isn't always an easy road. I have to say. Anybody who chooses to become a therapist, a counsellor, or a psychotherapist, it's not an easy road. Sometimes we have tough, difficult decisions that we need to work out in supervision. And to be able to do that, we need to feel safe enough, confident in our supervisor, and also confident in their ability to hold us, certainly emotionally, I'm talking emotionally, when we may have to make some tricky or difficult decisions.
Indeed. Super duper handouts. Where can you get that? Well, you just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, navigate to episode 323, that's 323. Right there on the page, you can download Engaging with Clinical Supervision. And it speaks about getting the right supervision for you and your client. It covers the normative, restorative, and formative areas that we've discussed today. It talks about barriers to engaging in your supervision. But then there's a section that you may really enjoy. It's called the professional stages. And it looks and tries to map where you might be within your counseling journey and what you might be looking to get out of supervision at those various stages. And then there's a little bit about managing risk and ethical problem solving with the supervisor. And then it ends off with online working and the impact of online working and how that might look in supervision. So go and get that super duper handout, counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab 323. You'll be able to download that, hold it in your hand, put it in your file, refer to it often. So there it is. That's our ethical sustainable practice for today. We now move on to Practice Matters. This is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where the intrepid Rory goes out seeking those that have the knowledge that can shine and illuminate the path for us. They speak about their expertise. And another returning guest that we're so grateful to have, it's of course Susie Jamerson, part 2, Rory, that we're listening to today, about the topic of regulation.
Yes, in a series of 3 interviews, which started in episode 322, where I spoke with Dr. Anna Guy on the subject of regulation, I return to this and speak to Susie Jamerson, who returns to us to speak about regulation and her thoughts on how regulation may, if it ever comes to pass, impact on the profession. I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
In the second of 3 interviews with professionals in the field of counselling and psychotherapy, we return to the topic of statutory regulation. This issue has recently drawn significant attention following a series of articles in the Guardian newspaper about Ella Jenner, who successfully brought a civil claim against her former therapist in the High Court, where the judge ruled it trespass to the person. And that's a technical term because this was a civil case, not a criminal case. However, her case involved allegations of rape and sexual assault by her therapist. I'm delighted to welcome back Susie Jamerson, who will share her insights and observations on the subject of regulation. So, Susie, it's lovely to speak with you again.
Thank you, Rory, for having me back. It's lovely to be here. And I haven't read the Guardian article, but I did listen to this on Woman's Hour on Radio 4.
What were your views? I didn't hear the Woman's Hour piece, but what was your views on what you heard?
What I have taken away from it with my not brilliant memory is how much time and effort client took have to go through a process to prove that she had indeed been abused. I think it was something horrendous like 7 years. It was a long, long time.
That is an awful... That wasn't actually in the article, the Guardian article, but that is a huge amount of time. And, you know, one can only imagine the amount of stress and anxiety and emotional toll this took on the individual. And I think we have to acknowledge her courage as well. You're very courageous to do this and go public, waive anonymity. But it has brought up the contentious issue of should counselling be regulated? Should the government regulate counselling and psychotherapy?
So here's my perspective. I am possibly more pro-regulation than anti-regulation. But as I said to you when I wrote to you a few days ago, it's very conditional. So if we were to go down the regulatory route, I would want it to be as fair as possible. And the position that I'm sitting in at the moment is whenever we put a stake in the ground, which we would be doing if we went down the regulation route, we have a business as usual, sticking away at the moment, it's all good-ish. We then go and put this great big stake in the ground that says, those of you on this side can't work anymore because you don't come up to the standard required, and those of you on this side can. Because there has to be some kind of conditionality built into where do we start to regulate from. And that is my concern. So it's not a straightforward down pro-regulation, let's just go do it. I think that there is scope to have regulation, but it needs to be very carefully thought, very careful. And that's where my concern comes.
So you've kind of outlined that once this line's been drawn in the sand, use the word stake, be put in the ground, that there will be people who are one side of this stake who are in, you can practice, you're in, and there'll be those who will be left behind or may not be able to get in. Who would those people be? Who would be the people who'd be left behind, do you think?
My concern would be that it would follow a similar pattern of standardization that ScopeEd has brought into our lives recently. And it's very cut and dry. If you're let's say we'll use the BACP as an example because I understand the membership in the BACP. MBACP, you fall into column A. If you're accredited, you can fall into column B. If you are senior accredited, you can fall into column C. But does that mean that somebody in column C is a better therapist than somebody in column A? Absolutely not. So how can we regulate when the way that we define who we are as professionals and how we work, this is what I mean, it's such a precarious topic. And I'll give you a little bit of my background. I come from the corporate world. I was in corporate governance and controls and all that kind of stuff for a very long time. And what typically happens in the world, those people who do the work, the subject matter experts, and that's a term in IT, but in our world, the counsellors are the subject matter experts. And then you have the management, the overriding people that make the decisions. The management don't understand the nuances of what the subject matter experts do. The subject matter experts are often not fully consulted in the process of making procedures, governance standards, audits, etc. And so therefore, the subject matter expert ends up just implementing what the management decide is best practice, isn't always best practice. And if the subject matter expert disagrees with something, they're often bullied into implementing it because somebody more senior has made the decision that this is best practice. So this is where my concerns are embedded. And I honestly don't know how we could effectively bring in regulation without an enormous upheaval of our entire profession.
I mean, that's quite an interesting perspective, isn't it? The fact that, it's almost like who watches the watchers, if you like, who oversees them. The other thing that kind of strikes me is 20 odd years ago when I started, practicing, shall we say, as a student, as a student therapist, there were about 500 different forms of therapy. And now I read recently that people have literally stopped counting. And what is a therapist? I mean, I was in Hebden Bridge the other day, which is a very artistic community. Hello to all the listeners in Hebden. And I noticed an advert for someone who was a life teacher. And I'm sure that within that endeavour, and I'm sure the person who did it was very competent and very committed and would offer great value, but how much of that would have been the use of counselling skills? That's the thing, isn't it? If you regulate a heating engineer for gas compliance, him or her or they have a specific job they do specifically that can be evidenced and looked at. But our profession's so wide, isn't it?
It's huge, but we have brains, minds, emotions. We have a nervous system. We are very unique in our sharing of the human condition. Each of us is different. So a boiler is structured and put together, and it has instructions, and somebody is trained to fix it, repair it, maintain it, etc. It's following a very defined set of circumstances or set of instructions. Counselling, therapy is so different. And a life teacher title for me is creative branding, actually. Standing out. You've remembered this person. You've remembered their title. Well done to them. And therefore, how could you possibly regulate that if it wasn't a specific training and qualification, certified, insurable, etc.? And I think we're in a circular place at the moment where, yes, regulation might help therapists be less harmful, but my personal opinion would be you can be harmful whether you're regulated or not. We have people in the police force who may be harmful, but they're all trained in relatively the same way to do a particular job. And I think also as humans who turn up to be a counsellor and a therapist, where do we draw the line at the way they ask questions, the language that they use, their facial expressions, especially when there are no witnesses to our work? I almost think it's impossible to regulate.
But you did say earlier on that on balance, you were kind of pro-regulation.
Yes.
Yes. So what if you looked at that aspect? What would you put in place in terms of, if you were kind of advising the government, what would you say to them?
I'd go right back to the training. I would start to license training providers and make sure that those training providers meet very specific criteria. Because one of the things that we've noticed, I did my level 4, I came out of it, wanted to register with the BACP and discovered I couldn't. I had to take the certificate of proficiency. That's fair. I passed. I went on. I became accredited. But I think would always want to ask the question, I did what I thought was a really, really good training course. Why wasn't it accredited? Can it only be accredited by one membership body? Who gets to decide what is the threshold of competence? Mine was overseen by the CPCAB, which I believe is a reputable organisation. But I think that's where we would need to start. And as students qualify and come out of their diplomas or their degrees or whatever it is that they've done, and then they head for a particular membership body of their own choice, or maybe their course is designed to steer towards one, like UKCP pretty much does that, then we're bringing therapists into the profession who are already meeting particular criteria. And so maybe regulation takes 30 years or 20 years. I don't know. I really don't know what the answer is, but I think what I am concerned about is my next door neighbour could set themselves up as a therapist if they wanted to and charge exactly the same amount that I do, but people turn up in their drive and knock on their door instead of mine.
Yes.
Nothing to stop them doing that.
Absolutely nothing at the moment. I mean, for those people who are listening, you might find that actually surprising. But that brings me on to my next question. Terms like psychotherapist generally, and I'm before I get any letters in the post bag, I'm going to say generally psychotherapy isn't regulated. There are some exceptions, which I'm not going to go into because it is a bit long-winded. And counsellor are not protected characteristics. In other words, if I decided to stick a sign on my door and says, Dr. Rory, all your ailments cured, I would soon find myself in very great difficulty from the General Medical Council and the law in general, because the doctors, medical doctors, is a protected title. There's quite a few protected title. Art therapist is a protected title. However, counselling and psychotherapy aren't protected titles. Could that be a potential direction of travel to protect the title and then map the qualifications and experience to the title?
I think that's a very fair point, And it reminds me of a meeting I went to when I first moved to Scotland, and I went to a BACP organised meeting. I always seem to bring up the BACP, but I am a member of the BACP. And I went to this meeting in Glasgow, and I was surprised. It kind of turned into a sort of trade union bun fight kind of meeting, because at the time, the NHS had declared that they didn't understand or recognise the term counsellor. And a lot of people, counsellors, were unable to find employment or were losing employment. And they were looking to the BACP to fix this issue for them. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh gosh, this isn't what I expected to turn up to today. But it was very interesting. And I think, we have a duty to protect the public. That's an absolute given. Genuinely do not believe that a regulated profession will protect the public, individual professionals who are not operating to professional and ethical and even legal standards. Hence the case that we started this conversation with. A female went into therapy in good faith and had a diabolical experience. Would regulation have stopped that?
Really,
I don't believe it would.
That's a really interesting point. When I trained 20 years ago, it's no secret, I'm from the north of England. I live just outside Manchester, but I trained in Hyde. And Hyde, of course, is ubiquitous, if you like, for the behaviour of Harold Shipman, the infamous doctor, whose surgery I would pass on a regular basis as I travelled to my training. And what really brought it home was that one of the peers that I studied with, his grandmother was murdered by Harold Shipman. And Harold Shipman was a doctor. He was highly regulated. And it does beg the question, I'm not sure about the case of this particular person in The Guardian, and I don't really want to kind of dwell on her. I think that would be unfair. But as a general point, how does regulation protect the general public? I mean, yes, you can strike someone off and they cannot practice again, but actually there are plenty of people who are in regulated professions. I know of one who was struck off and still practices, and there's nothing the law can do about it.
I think that the fact that regulation could protect the public is a bit of a myth. I think perhaps, talking to you today, and you always ask me questions that really get me to think. What I would like to see from regulation actually is, forgive me for my sweeping statement, I don't want to sound judgmental, but I'm probably going to be, is to eradicate the charlatans. Like, the example I just used, my next door neighbour could set themselves up as a counselor and charge the same as me and, say to somebody, oh, I think you should go and do this, that and the other. That's what I would like regulation to actually be able to do. I don't think delving into our profession for all the people who have given up 4 years of their life, become qualified, and beyond that, and all the CPD that we do and all the care that we put into our work, that they should in any way be the focus of a regulation question that says, now, are you good enough? Do you meet this threshold? Because I think that is a given. There will be some bad eggs that seep through, unfortunately. It happens in every single profession, because that's the human. It's not the profession that causes it. It's the human that causes it. But, I live in a place where there is a person who calls themselves a counsellor. They don't have a qualification. They aren't insured. They don't even go by a name. Can't say any more than that. That's going to sound like a bit of a strange statement. They couldn't be touched for love nor money. Yet I could list a number of things here that they have done and said that are profoundly unprofessional and profoundly unethical, but they're untouchable. And those are the humans that I would like to see moved on from calling themselves counsellors, psychotherapists, therapists, coaches, etc. And that's what I would prefer regulation was focused on, because the other way is so severe and it will upset probably more people than it would benefit. And that for me doesn't feel appropriate to put our profession through that.
Well, Susie, thank you for such a balanced view. I'm sure the people who are listening will have a lot to talk about amongst their peers, maybe their supervisors, maybe in their professional bodies. You never know; we might get someone from the Labour Party, Wes Streeping, who's the current health minister, I believe, maybe listening in. Who knows? But I think it's a very, very interesting perspective, and I think what you're coming to is that maybe the title may need the protection and the training. It seems like a two-pronged attack. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. So, Susie Jamerson, thank you so much.
Massive thank you to Susie Jamerson. Thank you to you, Rory, for going out, bringing us the interviews here on Practice Matters. And we now head straight into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And in Student Services today, we're going to be speaking about powering up your skills. This is your counselling skills through observation.
Yes, I mean, I think that counselling is when you're doing counselling training, it's an interesting kind of learning experience, because you have straight lectures on theory, talking about theory. You might be talking about Eric Berne or Carl Rogers or Sigmund Freud or all the other theorists. And then you have to apply the theory to practice, and that usually is in skills. And lots of teachers, myself and Ken included, would thinking about something called social learning theory. And social learning theory is where people apply their knowledge, test out their knowledge through observation. And when you're doing your triads or your pair skill work, that's exactly what you're engaging in. You're engaging in something called social learning theory. So that's something you can take away from the podcast today. I'm doing a bit of social learning theory. And social learning theory is where you watch others practice their skills. So usually in skills, you have an observer, you have someone who plays the role of the speaker, which is the client, but we don't use the client in training. Usually it's the speaker and the listener. And what will happen is that there'll be an interaction, a counselling skills session, and then everybody will feed back and see what they observed. And that is how you learn. You learn by practicing, trying things out, and then getting feedback and saying, oh, I could have tried that, or I could have tried this. And it's a very, very powerful way of developing counselling skills, and one that's kind of tried and tested, Ken. It's one of those teaching principles that it works. It does what it says on the can.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, Rory, that counselling skills, irrespective of your modality, the skills kind of are very, very similar. In other words, the skills are what we use in the room with the client. Now, the theory underpinning the skills might be very different, and we might use the skills differently according to different modalities. But the interesting thing for me is during our counselling training and even out into professional working life, we rarely, if ever, get to see another counsellor using counselling skills in a session. So we do the role play within the classroom to simulate that, because there's confidentiality around counselling and psychotherapy. And I'm trying to think of another profession that you might study for where you never actually get to see what you've got to do actually demonstrated properly. And it can make it quite tricky. It can leave you wondering, oh, am I doing this right? This is my style. I wonder how others do it. And during your training is a great opportunity to learn through this observation that Rory has brought for us today. It's a privilege that you may not get easily back again. Because once you graduate, very rarely, I don't know how many triads you've been in, Rory, since you finished. I'm not counting teaching others. Maybe on CPDs from time to time, if we're doing some training, we might jump into a triad or something like that, but it's rare, So take advantage while you are a student. And I think that the most powerful place to be in a triad. So a triad is a speaker, a listener, and an observer who's going to watch and feed back. I think the most powerful place to be within that triangle is the observer. I think that's where the richest learning can be. And it's interesting because it almost sounds like, oh no, but it'd be much better to be the counsellor because then you're learning and then you get the feedback. But as the observer, you are outside the bubble of the counsellor and the speaker and the listener, as it were. You're watching, you're almost helicoptering in. It gives you the opportunity to think differently. So as a counsellor, when the client is bringing their material, you are listening as if you were them, looking through their eyes. When you're an observer, you can watch the interaction slightly differently. You can look at it from more of a theory perspective. So here's something that we train in my little side project called Counselling Skills Academy, which sponsors this very spot. You will have heard it. And within Counselling Skills Academy, the observer's job is to have a list of all the different counselling skills: silence, reflection, summarizing, use of non-directing questions, whatever they are. Have a list of those skills down and a little description of what those skills actually do. If you think about the different skills are used in different places for different reasons. So they're almost little tools in a way, these skills. And the right tool at the right skill at the right time in a client interaction can be incredibly powerful. The wrong skill at the wrong time can be clunky and not work very well. As the observer, you get to watch that happening. So I'll go back to my list. So you've got the list of all the different skills on a piece of paper and what that skill does. In other words, what does that tool do? A little short description. And as you're watching the interaction, watch the listener, watch the person playing the role of the counselor. What skill did they use? So the client brought some material, brought some narrative. What of those skills on your paper did they use? Was it effective? And you get to look and see and be out of the actual conversation, as it were, so you can look differently and evaluate, is that effective? Would I have used that skill? What skill would I have used? Why would I have used that skill? And it gives you a lot of learning, being the observer, I guess, as being the watcher within that triad.
Yeah, I think it also gives you a lot of things as you say, you can take away where, look at others' practices and think, well, I might do it this way or I might do it that way. And I think it's totally invaluable. And I'd agree. I think the observer does have the more privileged position. They tend to get more out of it. And I also think there's a little kind of not a trick, but a technique that you could use for feedback that we used to use when we trained therapists. And if there's a triad, so there's an observer, there's a listener, we'll say the counsellor, there's a speaker, we'll say the client. It's always best to get the speaker's feedback first. The person who played the role of client, get their feedback first, because in my experience, the observer speaks first. It colours and can alter the feedback from the speaker, because they go, oh yeah, well, I agree with that. It's not as raw. It's not as immediate. So, if there's anybody here listening, facilitating skills groups, any tutors, encourage the learners to get the feedback first and foremost from the person who's having the session, the speaker, and then go to the observer. And I think the one thing we've not mentioned, Ken, which is equally important, is for the observer to observe both the person using the skills and the person playing the client role. Because, sometimes I've observed someone using an intervention and, the person playing the role of the client flinching or nodding and opening up. And I think that's a really good use of observational skills by saying, when you said that, this is how the person changed. This is how they opened up. This is how they became less anxious. They said, yes, that's how it is. I really feel heard. So it's really important that the feedback is two ways. But it's a really powerful tool. And I am struck at just going through this topic that it's probably one of the things that practitioners never practice when they qualify. They naturally think they've got the skills. They've done their qualification. We may train in other things, but is there a? I mean, I know you operate one, but there's very few specialist counselling skills trainings available outside of first practice. So it's a bit of a one to ponder, really, isn't it, Ken? That's our toolkit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not here to plug Counselling Skills Academy, but that is exactly why it was started, because of that gap, and because of that uncertainty. Am I doing this right? It's tricky in training, and Rory and I have been counselling tutors, and we know the challenges that are around breaking up into triads. And you might have a group that breaks out into triads, and then you kind of go and you do your skills practices. And the tutor will try to kind of visit all of the triads, but it's not possible to visit all the triads all of the time, because the tutor's there maybe observing or giving feedback or checking on skills and all that. So you may find that in your entirety of your skills practice as a practitioner, that you're viewed few times and given very little feedback. I'm kind of putting that next to how much feedback you might get on the theory work that you put in, that is easier to mark and easier to recognize and easier to see. And the whole point of Counselling Skills Academy was for students to gain confidence, but also for qualified practitioners to be able to look and re-look at those skills and flex those skill muscles again. And we've got a little community where we break out into triads, and within those triads there's a little bit of training of the blueprint to follow within that triad. And the learning and the transformations have been amazing, with a lot of people coming out going, wow, that is really, and I'm talking about seasoned professional counselors here, that's really made me reconsider my use of skills. So yes, it's an interesting thing. The skills, we use them every single session without fail. Are they the best they can be? And how can we grow? How can we learn? And, even outside of counseling, the triads, we're speaking about observational learning here. We can learn a lot about skills. Specifically when you're in an interaction with a fellow human being and you suddenly feel deflated by that interaction, you can observe, what was that? What made me feel like that? And it's all learning in self. It might not apply directly to counseling skills, but sometimes it can. You might be in an interaction with somebody, maybe a sales assistant in a shop, and you actually leave feeling slightly elevated, higher, going, wow, that was a really interesting and good interaction. The question is, what's the difference? What made you feel, or what caused you to feel that difference? What were they showing? Can it be broken down and related to how we show up with our clients? And it can't always, but sometimes it can. And the observational learning extends beyond just sitting in triads. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's a good topic. I think it's an evergreen topic. It's something we should be revisiting time and time again. Any final thoughts on powering up your skills?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you use the term powering up, and I think it's a really good. Is it a simile or a metaphor? I can remember. It's a metaphor, isn't it? It's a metaphor. A metaphor. No, please, no letters in the postbag if it's not. It's a metaphor, and I think counselling skills are the engine of your practice. The theories and the other knowledge provide different functions, but the actual engine of your practice that will drive your practice forward and give clients the best attention, the best outcomes, the best chance of working through what's happening is the skill of communication. And the research shows that, the relationship and, what the client expects are the big arbiters of successful therapy. And, I think sometimes that skills are a bit not put the focus on. There's a lot of training on other modalities and other interventions, rightly so, but skills are how they delivered. That's the engine of your practice, the thing that makes it go forward. So if there's anything I'd like you to take away, just think about maybe tinkering around the engine room and tuning the engine up from time to time. It doesn't do any harm.
Doesn't. At Counselling Skills Academy, it's counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's a 50% discount for anybody that is listening to the podcast. You just use the code that's on the page. That's Counselling Skills. That's episode 323, and we're so delighted that you joined us today. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yes, thank you so much for sticking with us. We started with ethical, sustainable practice, and we had a little chat, a little walk down, engaging with clinical supervision, what your needs are, and are they being met in supervision. In Practice Matters, we had a second interview on the subject of regulation with Susie Jamerson. If you want to hear the first part of that interview with Dr. Anna Guy, then go to counsellingtutor.com, look at the podcast tab and go to episode 322. And then finally, in student services, we talked about power up your skills. We talked about how we learn through observation and came to the point that your skills are the engine of your practice. So that ends today's episode. Thank you so much for all those people who've taken the time to leave reviews on iTunes or Podchaser, or even have shared the podcast in their social media pages, or on their LinkedIn, or wherever you live in the world of social media. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.